Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Carbon Offsetting, Real Impact or False Comfort. I'm Julie Fennell, Managing Director of Mobility Ways. We work with large organisations to support them to measure, report and reduce on their Scope 3 commuter emissions. Hosting today's panel debate, we have former BBC News Science editor and author and one of the UK's most experienced environmental journalists, David Shukman. We have a number of David's books, The Response, to give away today. All you need to do is participate in today's Slido, which we'll see on the right-hand side of your screens. Add your details to take part in our polls and submit questions for the Q&A at the end. Don't forget to upvote your favourite questions. Without further ado, I will hand over to David to introduce the rest of the panel.
Julie, thanks very much indeed. And it's great to be here and with you all. And it really is a great topic that I think you've picked, carbon offsetting, real impact or false comfort, because I just come across this question so often in my work in different aspects of climate change, different sectors, different industries. A few years back, I was invited in by a Formula One racing team who were trying to plan their journey to net zero. And they said, they recognized that they had to do a great deal of carbon reduction, but that there would be residual emissions that they would need to try to offset. And they said, we're really pleased. We've done a deal with a reforestation project, and it'll last for 25 years. And I said, you do know that most trees don't really start pulling in significant volumes, quantities of carbon until they reach the age of 10, 15, 20. And then you've got to have some structure to keep them going for decades, ideally a century, and their faces fell. I just think there's a lot of confusion around this issue. And of course, there are some real challenges. I remember filming in Ghana, a country that some of you may know. It's a fantastic place, but we were way over in the west in the forests, and filming a reforestation scheme on a very large scale, dozens of people planting little saplings. It looked very impressive, but it was remote. And I came away with the question in my mind about how easy would it be to police really what's going on? How reliable would any offsets be if a company bought carbon credits thinking that they were linked to this particular project? And indeed, there was a German power company that had bought the first credits for this project. And you just think, is it dependable? Is it reliable? But I'm sure we'll explore all of these questions. So we're going to have a fantastic session here. Let me introduce our panelists. So Julie has done her own introduction, and we'll be hearing more from her during the course of the event. Dr. Matt Sawyer is a physician and sustainability specialist focused on planetary health. He helps organizations develop practical strategies to reduce emissions and achieve their net zero goals. So we'll hear from him pretty shortly. And then there's Professor Hugh Montgomery, Professor of Intensive Care Medicine at UCL, and really significantly for this event, co-chair of the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change, a really important document providing the critical link based on evidence between climate change and human health. You may also have seen him at the National Emergency Briefing last November, or indeed in the film that's been produced as a result of that event. So he's a leading figure in this. Just before we hear from Hugh, and he's going to give us a kind of keynote rundown of his perspective on this issue, but we're really keen to involve you. This is designed to be an interactive session. There'll be a chance later on for you to pose questions to our panel, and we'll be really keen to see those from you. But before we just embark on that, let's just have a little look at opinion across everybody joining this. So there's the Slido code. If you haven't signed up yet, have a little look at that. So you've got the four options. Which statement of these four best reflects your view of carbon offsetting? Useful, but only after reducing emissions as much as possible. So at the moment, that's pretty firmly in the lead. Second, a distraction from real emissions reduction. By the way, I love it when these change during the course of the poll. 30% at the moment think it's a distraction from real emissions reductions. Undecided, want to learn more, at 17%. Well, you're all very welcome on this session, and let's hope we can create some clarity if there's confusion. And bobbing at the end there, 8%, it's a valuable climate tool that should be scaled up. This dropped to 7% for that last one. And I think it represents a really interesting span of opinions. Obviously, the number one at the moment is useful, but only after reducing emissions as much as possible. So we'll see if that holds firm as we go through the discussion during the course of this morning. So I think now is a good moment. Actually, we've just nudged to 51% for the top one. Let's see how things go. So I'm going to invite Hugh Montgomery to take to the stage. Hugh, you've got great to see you there. I don't know if that's a stethoscope around your shoulders, but it would be terrific if it was. I like props like that. Hugh, you've got 10 minutes to take us through, to tackle the subject of your talk, real zero or net zero, and we'll pick up with the discussion once you're done. So over to you, Hugh.
Terrific. Thank you so much, David. And thank you all very much indeed for coming. I agree with David. This is a really important topic, which is poorly understood. I'm going to canter through my own personal views on this, but I'm going to underpin it, of course, with the scientific data. This should remind you of the problem. We're releasing colossal quantities of greenhouse gas. And if you look at deforestation and other factors that drive CO2 emissions, CO2 equivalents, we're chucking out nearly 55 billion metric tons a year. And remember, a billion is an American billion, that's 1,000 million tons. And each ton is 1,000 kilograms. Each kilogram is 523 litres. And that CO2 is going to last for a very long time. It takes 400,000 years to clear what we emit today. Around a fifth of it will still be boiling our planet in 33,000 years from now, and 7% in 100,000 years. But we're increasingly emitting more. We went up 0.8% in 2024, and we end up 1.1% in 2025. Now, that may be plateauing off soon, but look at the area in red. That's what we have to clear. But worse news than this is that atmospheric CO2 emissions are now uncoupled, or CO2 concentrations are uncoupled from emissions. And that's because the land sinks, the ability to the land to draw down carbon dioxide is failing. That's partly in oceans, but it's partly in soil and rainforests, for instance. And as we heat tundra, it starts respiring. And that's why we see atmospheric CO2 concentrations here running through to the present date, going up at an ever increasing rate. Every year now is faster than the year before, independent of emissions. We've punched through this year around 433.8, 433.95 parts per million. Now, on top of that, energy gain is rising faster than the emissions are. We've uncoupled that as well. We've gone up from adding the equivalent of 3 Hiroshima bombs of energy per second to our atmosphere to currently 14.8. And that's in part because we've changed surface albedo, the ability of snow and ice to reflect, and low altitude cloud reflect heat back into space. That's doubled energy gain in only the last 5 years. If you want to see what that looks like, this is the energy gain we're seeing all the time going on around us. And it's led to this massive inflection point. Temperatures were going up steadily, and now they've suddenly accelerated. And as we see the oceans with the El Nino events vomiting out the energy we force fed them, and it's a lot, because 92% of the energy we've added goes into oceans, we are likely to punch through 1.8 Celsius within the next 16 months. We punched through 1.63, of course, in 2003. And you see exactly the same effects, not just on land, but in oceans, this sudden inflection point. And remember, that's not going to slow down. These temperatures are accelerating, and they will continue to do so. And as they do, they drive extreme weather events. We're reaping what we sow. These were the extreme fires in Canada a couple of years ago, the effect in New York as the smoke drifted south, the problems in Spain as we baked the soil and then had sudden rainfall that killed hundreds of people. This was Los Angeles just over a year ago, the view from space as it was ablaze. And these are what we've seen just in the last couple of years. India punching through 52 Celsius. Australia punching through nearly 50 Celsius in February of this year. And of course, we had 40 days of continuous rain in the UK, followed by a drought, followed by flooding affecting also Spain, followed by Portugal, and us punching through 35 Celsius in May, just recently, 40 Celsius in Portugal. These huge temperature spikes. Now, globally, the banks were saying, this, remember, was a year ago, we're expecting a 3 Celsius world. We think it'll be a lot more than that. But let's just look at what the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries and Insurers say 3 Celsius looks like. They say it leads to loss of 50% or more of the global economy. They say it kills half the world's population, and they will have migrated first. And they say it would have led to a high level of extinction of higher order life on Earth. That includes us. But on the way to get there, which won't take us very long because this is a matter of only decades of timing, we're going to see societal collapse. And it's not just environmental scientists who are saying this. This was the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. The report that was commissioned, they buried it because it's too frightening. It was released under Freedom of Information Act, but redacted. And some of you will have seen it earlier this year, saying that Britain's food and water supply, and I'm quoting directly, were almost certain to be on a decline and collapse trajectory by 2030. And a realistic possibility by 2030 that are then at strategic risk of catastrophic failure. That's not being able to buy avocados and quinoa. Catastrophic failure in this country in 4.5 years' time. And that's echoed by the Joint Intelligence Services report, again, commissioned, suppressed, released under Freedom of Information Act and redacted. Again, national security of Britain with food shortage and economic disaster potentially just years away. And everyone from the World Meteorological Organization to major banks and insurers warning that we are certain now to have lost 20% of global domestic product within the next 25 years or so. It could be 50% or more. Indeed, the actuaries warn us that our economy might not exist at all if we do not mitigate climate change right now. So the conversation this morning we're about to have is, how do we go about doing this? Well, the first way of doing it is, of course, as the first bit that poll was, we've got to cut emissions. 1.5 Celsius is no longer manageable. It's never been safe, and it certainly isn't now. If we were to think it's safe and plausible, we should have cut emissions from 2019 levels by 43% by 2030. Emissions are actually up 7%. So we do have to stop the emissions, but we're also going to have to do geoengineering, and we might have to consider drawing some of those emissions down again. Does offsetting substitute for real emission cuts to reach net zero? That's the plan. As we all know, you cut your emissions and then you say, well, I'll offset in some way, shape or form. But offsetting is lied about and really badly sold. Sometimes people say they've offset their emissions by reducing emissions somewhere else. In other words, they say, well, we've applied solar lamps and solar cookers in Africa. Sometimes they say it's to prevent an increase in emissions, or so they're saying, well, we'll keep going up, or we'll plant some trees, or we'll provide solar panel powers so that the rise that we would have seen doesn't take place. But the problem with these net zero approaches is that nets are largely full of holes. So here are some trajectories from 2026 to 2045. Lots of companies say we're going to be net zero by 2045. Well, that graph could look like this. Emissions go up and then only drop at the end. The area under the curve is enormous and lethal to everyone. It could look like that, a steady ramp up and a more slow glide down, also catastrophic. It could look like that, much better, but still potentially inadequate. And there are lots of companies doing this. If we just look, for instance, at Shell, they say they'll be at net zero, that was their intent, by 2025, so that was last year. But it only applied to the energy they burn themselves, so the power that they use, for instance, and the power they purchased in as Scope 2. That leaves Scope 3, which is nearly 93% of emissions, completely outside what they say would be a net zero target. And lots of companies do this. You've got to watch out for what they're talking about. But we also know that net zero approaches for corporates that are buying them have largely failed. This is one report from last year, but it says what everyone else has said. It hasn't worked. Could it work? Well, we had this paper in Nature Geoscience in 2025 saying that if we were to restore every wetland, peatland, mangrove swamp, plant a tree everywhere you can plant a tree where one doesn't exist, and if those trees didn't burn down or blow down, you could reduce about 5 years worth of emissions. Is that worth having? Sure, it's definitely worth having, but given that we're chucking out 55 billion tonnes a year and continuing to do so, it's not going to fix the problem, especially since we put 2.5 trillion tonnes of CO2 into the atmosphere already. Could we use industrial scale carbon capture and storage? So sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it, for instance, in geological sites. Well, so far, in total, ever, we've drawn down 383 million tonnes. This is not a technology that's known to work. And in fact, that amount is less than the USA emits. I've said they're in 6 days. It turns out to be in 6 hours, though. So net zero, in my view, should be substituted by real zero emissions reductions. We can do that in a number of ways. We can stop financing the banks that were driving this. The banks put in, the top 25 banks last year, nearly $1 trillion into further fossil fuel expansion last year. So we need to cut off their fuel supply. We need to move our energy supplies to 100% renewable if we've not done that. We need to move to plant-based foods because 38% of emissions come from the food supply chain. But for today's conversation, particularly, we need to move our transport and travel. It's a very big contributor to carbon emissions and to poor health from particulates, for instance. And we need to substitute active transport from fossil fuel combustion. And we can do other things like voting and influencing those around you. On the green travel front, this has multiple benefits. It drops the greenhouse gas emissions, which is great, but it has enormous health co-benefits to 38 different cancers and to everything from diabetes, obesity, kidney failure, heart failure, and stroke. That's not only good for our health, but it also reduces the greenhouse gas emissions that come from the healthcare that would accrue. So that's where I will stop. This is the non-profit that I'm involved in running, if anyone's interested. But let me now stop and hand back to David. David, thank you for allowing me to speak.
Hugh, it's great to have your run through of those points and to get the data, as it were, out of the way, but very much up in front of us all, because every time I've seen those graphs before, but every time we see them, it's quite striking. You know, just as a little personal insight, I was speaking at the Hay Festival at the back end of May, and during the heat wave, and it was 30 degrees on the border of Wales. And we were in these enormous marquees that were completely unventilated. And for the first time in my life, I was asked as chair of an event to give a health warning. I mean, I'm used to being asked, you know, can you point out the fire exits, or can you sort of explain something about the proceedings? But here we actually had the first time of, can you, if you're feeling faint because of the heat and the temperature might have been 35 inside, stick an arm in the air and alert the stewards. And I added to that my own health warning, which was look out for others who might not be in a position to actually think straight, because I gather the first organ to be affected by extreme heat is the brain, and you start making dumb decisions. This is very real. It's now, and as you so cogently laid out. The idea of shifting away from net zero to real zero is really, really striking, I think. How would you best sort of argue that in a way net zero just doesn't get us far enough? It's provided a really useful target. It's obviously become very highly publicized. More and more governments around the world, I think most governments around the world, have a net zero target. So I'm just wondering where you think it fails and why real zero is what you argue we should all pursue instead.
It's a good question, David. So, I mean, in fact, I was looking at the poll and I agreed with 3 out of 4 of the potential approaches. And firstly, it's been a distraction and it's been a con. So it's allowed people, governments indeed, as well as businesses, to say we're going to be net zero without saying whether it's scope 1 or scope 1, 2, and 3, by a date which is in the future with no trajectory to get there. which has allowed complacency and people basically not to do anything. So they haven't really driven down their emissions. And, in some ways it's understandable. The average CEO doesn't last 5 years in a company. They get their share options and cash in and get out. So they're not really looking to see where they'll be in 2040 because they won't have to know. So that's the first problem with it. The second problem is the scale of it. I mean, it's going to cost a ton of money to do that. And it's going to it distracts a little bit from just getting the emissions out of the system and lets people wait for the magic bullet. So to go, well, don't worry, there'll be something coming along, but there's something coming along with magic unicorns. And to give you the data, I mean, we've got 2.5 trillion tons of CO2 in the atmosphere that we need to clear. Negative carbon emission technologies, or NETs as they're also known, using carbon dioxide removal, drew down around 2.2 billion tons a year. That's what they do. That's mainly through tree planting. But the point you make is well made. There's actually a lot of those trees fall down or burn down and take a long time to do anything. Indeed, the entire Californian stock of offset trees burned down 2 years ago. That then leaves you, and that's 2.2 billion out of 54 billion. So almost a rounding area. If you look at the others, artificial CO2 removal, that's mainly biochar, which you'll understand. So biochar is essentially pyrolyze organic material at 350 to 750 degrees without oxygen. That then absorbs CO2 and it also can act as a nutrient on soil. But that only drew down 2 million tons. And at most, if we deployed that at huge scale, the most it could do is somewhere north of 1.5 billion tons out of 54. So another small quantity. The rest, if you look at biomass storage underground, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, enhanced weathering of basalt rocks, all of these other things, they've only reduced by 0.5 million tons a year. These are basically unproven technologies. And you've heard of direct carbon capture and storage with these sort of what are called artificial trees. You'd need 40 billion of those to get deployed. So these are things that we're going to have to do, right? We are going to have to draw down CO2, no question. And in my view, we are going to have to geoengineer as well. But at the moment, we can't wait for that. We don't have time. The thing we can do now is to stop emitting, and we must do that right now. And one final point on that is we've been underestimating. We had 2 papers in Nature saying we can now expect impacts we thought would be extreme at 5 degrees. We can now expect at 1.5 to 2, which is where we're at now. And we also know that we've been shielded by sulfate particles and coal dust particles, reflecting light back. When we get rid of those, which we will have to when we stop burning fossil fuels, that has the heating effect equivalent of adding 200 parts per million of CO2. So the heat effect equivalent would be taking us to 650 or 700 parts per million. And the safe limit, which wasn't safe for Paris, was around 450. So we're out of time now. What we've got to do is stop emitting.
So Hugh, thanks for that. And let's take those thoughts and then apply them, if you like, in terms of pragmatic thinking for the people who are listening, taking part in this webinar. And great to have you all. I think you're in the several hundred is the total. Very impressive indeed. Matt, I want to come to you. There is a well-recognized body, the Science Based Targets Initiative, which actually just the other day updated its guidance to companies, which produced a very spirited debate from different things. But I think at the heart of this is a challenge for all organizations. Where do you draw the line between judging that actually the effort has to be made on emissions reductions made by yourself, and then saying, well, actually, we can consider those over there to be residual, and therefore we might embark on some form of offsetting? How does that judgment get made, and where, in your view, might it be right for it to land?
Thank you, and thank you, Hugh, for an amazing presentation. I think you're absolutely right that there are some science-based targets, but the difficulty is that I don't think that there's a single switch point. You can't say, I've done this much, I can now switch my focus and do something else. For me, I think that there has to be this sort of, dual track or twin track. most of the effort goes into what you're responsible for, and then there is some at the end. I don't like no, I'll rephrase that. I love planting trees. I don't like planting trees just to be able to say in a number of decades' time they're going to have done some good. I think that there's lots of other good bits which we can come on to a little bit later on. But I think that you have to do absolutely both. But I think that, you know, different size organisations, I think, take different levels or different degrees of responsibility. A one-man band or a single owner of a small business, their footprint, their emissions is tiny compared to some of the big companies. So the bigger the organisation, the more responsibility that they have, the more robust their plans to change their banking, their pensions, their procurement, their travel. I think that that's, for me, where the most of the effort needs to be placed. Some of the smaller businesses who want to do things, I think, can be encouraged and enabled to do them, but I think that they need help and support and guidance to be able to do that. So I don't think that there is a single switch point. I think it's a transition, but I don't think that we can ever move away from taking responsibility for what we are doing in our organisations or what the organisations are doing.
Because I know this question has spawned a whole new vocabulary, hasn't there? I mean, obviously there's greenwashing. I mean, you know, the idea of picking up on Hugh's graph where nothing is done till 2049, and then presumably some CEO plants a few trees and has a photo opportunity, and that's considered to be enough. Well, that's the most cynical. Then there's something where there's more sort of cosmetic activities along the way, which are trumpeted as very virtuous and green, but actually don't really cut the mustard or make any real difference in terms of emissions reductions. And then you get something that's actually much more meaningful. Julie, I wonder what your sense is here. What are the kind of pitfalls, if you like, for organizations when they're navigating this, what they're perhaps trying to reduce their emissions, and what separates sheep from goats with this? Good intentions that don't really get you very far, as opposed to something that really drives down the emissions that Hugh has highlighted.
Yeah, do you know what? I kind of feel a bit for organisations, because I think in the UK we are so behind. You know, emissions still need benchmarking data, and most organisations just don't have that and don't know how to get that. And we've even created our own language because of that. You're talking about, you know, words. We've got a commutology team because we want to teach the science of the commute to our clients, because, you know, they don't know where to start. And so, you know, I think benchmarking exists because most organisations can't evidence yet that they're genuinely reducing commuting emissions. Or they just haven't started. So I think, you know, we've really got to start with the data. And I think any offsetting or OER claim on any category at this moment in time is premature because of that.
That's interesting. I hadn't realised. So there are plenty of schemes, the Carbon Disclosure Project, I mentioned Science-Based Targets Initiative, and many others, NGOs and consultancies and all kinds of organisations providing quite detailed carbon accounting, but you say that they actually don't include commuting or don't sufficiently take it into account.
They don't ever include commuting. Commuting is very much an afterthought. I actually think Scope 3 as a whole is quite an afterthought. And so having a baseline to start your benchmarking from is near on impossible. It's the reason we've created the commuter emissions level, because it's a baseline that you can measure against year on year.
I mean, it is very striking, isn't it? And of course, I mentioned greenwashing, and then what you said, commutology. I really like this new word you've invented. Of course, there's green hushing, where companies or organizations actually are doing quite good work, but they don't want to go public about it in case they're criticized or scrutinized by a number of, well, from different angles, actually. I mean, just as a counterpoint to this, not that long ago, Mark Carney, who best known in the UK context as former governor of the Bank of England and special envoy on climate change for the UN and played a very prominent role at the huge climate summit, COP26 in Glasgow in 2021, which was, by the way, my last assignment for the BBC before I left. So it's a very powerful memory for me. He actually said, we can't get to net zero greenhouse gases without robust voluntary carbon markets. In other words, a really properly policed system of, well, let's call it credits or offsetting or whatever. Matt, do you want to pick that up? I mean, the idea that we're not going to get there unless somehow we find a way of embracing this sector.
Absolutely. I think that I would probably start by saying, for me, I don't think offset should be used for any near-term targets. Any voluntary carbon markets, it's a supporting or a supplementary role. It is not a substitute for actual real term.
Let me just jump in, Matt, just to put a definition on near term.
So 5 to 10 years.
Okay,
so I think
fine.
That,
all right.
We need to be making significant reductions now, today, this week, this month, this year, changing the way that we travel, we eat, we heat, we finance. So I don't think offsetting should be used within the first 5 or 10 years anyway. And then it's a supplementary role rather than a substitution role. But there are arguments that could be made that private capital from industrial rich nations could flow to developing nations. But I think that there are 4 strict criteria that would need to be applied. Firstly, it's about additionality. This is a carbon reduction that would not have otherwise occurred. You can't just say, well, it was going to happen anyway, I'm just going to pay for it. That's double counting. For me, the planet doesn't really care where the greenhouse gas emissions come from.
No.
Any sort of shenanigans and sort of, sleight of hand accounting to say, but we're doing better than we were, it's nonsense. Second, I think it's about permanence. This is about permanently getting carbon and greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere. So anything that is then at risk of forest fires, for example, well, actually, that's a problem. I think that this is about avoiding any form of double counting, so that more than one company cannot say, but we've paid for this. And finally, I think that it's important to recognise the social co-benefit. So I like tree planting, but I like it because it gives me, there's a great organisation in North Yorkshire called Make It Wild. There's the NHS Forests scheme. This is about tree planting so that you get social benefits, personal health benefits, the physical, the mental. Patients get benefits when trees are planted on NHS sites because they have less time in hospital. So I want the social co-benefits of doing any actions through a sort of a voluntary carbon market to be recognised as well. So, Hugh, I kind of agree with geoengineering, but actually, I don't just want sort of big lumps of carbon being produced by machines that suck it down to the atmosphere. I want people to walk through the forests and be able to get the benefit of hearing the trees, hearing the birds sing. So for me, it's those social co-benefits as well as. So I think that there is an opportunity. But I think we have to be quite strict because there's been a lot of shenanigans over the decades, which I think have been disingenuous, to be polite.
And just to introduce a sort of another angle on all of this, when I first reported on carbon offsetting, this is now 20 odd years ago, one of the great arguments in favour of it was the cost of buying the offsets, the cost of paying for the carbon credits, assuming the carbon price was high enough, would itself be an incentive for organizations to try to avoid having to buy those credits by actually reducing their own emissions in the first place. It was meant to be kind of a sort of a little bit of not so much carrot and stick, for a chief financial officer to be faced with a carbon offsetting bill and say, well, hang on, can't we avoid some of this by making our own steps and undertaking our own measures to reduce that. Hugh, there is some evidence, Trove Research looked at 10,000 companies here and did actually find that the ones buying carbon credits cut their own emissions twice as fast as those that don't, which kind of supports that idea that actually the act of having to pay for carbon credits is its own incentive. That's kind of true, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure how you could get reverse causality or parallel association on this, couldn't you? I mean, it could be that the companies that are serious about making some sort of effort in cutting emissions are the ones who therefore plant stuff, and the planting stuff doesn't make any difference to the fact they were committed. It may just be a marker, in other words, of being virtuous. I'm not sure that the planting itself necessarily makes the difference, or that may play into the boardroom to say, well, actually, we can stop spending on all of that stuff if we were to do the other. I agree, though, completely with Matt. I mean, I would rather they spent the money directly on cutting emissions now, that cash, and take the action. And on those, of course, there are some quick no regret ones, which Matt alluded to. If we look at moving bank accounts and investments, you don't actually lose out by doing that. I mean, you might have done a little with Russia invading Ukraine on oil, but it's easy to move banks. It's easy to, and simple. Changing food is dead easy. You get a healthier workforce by miles. There are reasons why people like Google really promote healthy vegetable-based diets. It's a reason why New York hospitals have all moved to vegan by default menus. But it's healthier and it saves money. So these are no regrets. And transport is another one. It cuts the emissions and it produces a healthier, more active workforce who can capable of working. I mean, I was just wanting to pick up some of the other points made that I think were very well made. On the politics of this, we do have to advocate. We live in a world where politicians will only move into a permissive environment we create for them. So looking at transport issue, we hear people howling. They can't drive their 4x4. The low emissions zone stops them doing X or Y. We need to be on the front foot on this and saying, this sort of activity poisons people. It causes asthma, respiratory disease, cancer, dementia, a whole raft of things we'd rather get rid of. And we would like it to be that people can take that active transport as well. So we need to be vocal with our local politicians and our councils, as well as our national ones. And the same goes if we're looking for international or national taxation, it will only happen with voter pressure to do it. And the tax and dividend issue. And there's been some very interesting, as I'm sure you know, David, some very interesting creative taxation proposal. I do think that an effective carbon tax with a ratchet would indeed send signal to market and pivot investment to low carbon. But we can do the same with consumer. There was a cross-aisle, as you probably know, a cross-aisle proposal, Republicans and Democrats, 10 years ago in the States, suggesting 100%, well, so tax and 100% dividend. So let's take that to Britain. The idea would be that you would tax the carbon really aggressively at the site of import. So he said, well, that's got a very hard carbon footprint and it came from a foreign country, or at site of manufacture in Britain. But you take all of that taxation money and you distribute it equally to the whole of the British population. So that would mean on average, the British, every one of us on tax day, 4th of April, would wake up with £35,000 in our bank account that we didn't have before. Now, we can spend it how we like, but we might now find that a flight to America costs us £20,000, not £400. We might choose to take it. We've got 35 grand in our bank account, but we're more likely to spend that 35 grand on the stuff that is no longer expensive, is cheaper. And that then tilts the market. No one really hurts from this. It's a signal to market and it moves things. But the point again I'd make is we can't expect politicians to take those sorts of legislative actions unless we, the population, are making it clear to them that we're going to vote.
And it's so interesting, but I mean, no surprise with you as a physician bringing up the health impacts of climate change. I mean, I was really struck, and I've included this in my book. You know, there are 1 million British kids are being treated for asthma. The asthma bill for the NHS this decade, the decade we're in the middle of, is something like 45 billion pounds. Yeah. And you just think there's got to be a better way of doing things. And this picks up, Julie, on your point of, you know, actually we can move to cleaner forms of commuting. If there's ways of measuring that, you're actually going to end up with cleaner air and therefore a reduced burden on the health service that we all pay for. Matt, I wonder if you just pick up on this idea. Do you think the storytelling, the messaging around the impacts of climate change on health actually might provide more of an incentive? I mean, that's actually my reading of the situation, that it does. But what's your take on whether perhaps less climate, but actually the implications for personal health might be more of an incentive to reduce emissions?
Absolutely agree. I dream in carbon. I wake up on a morning and think of invisible gases in the environment, but not very many people do. What they really care about is their personal health, their well-being. Do they have access to clean water to drink, clean air to breathe, sufficient food to eat? And actually, I think that retelling the tale of greenhouse gases in a language and in a way that people understand actually goes across politics. If you ask people across the board, would you like to have a healthy green space to be able to go for a walk in? It actually doesn't matter whether you're left or right. The answer is yes. If you say to people, would we like a green and pleasant land, whatever country you're in, actually the answer is yes. So I think that there are ways that we can use health as that pivot. And I think that there's been some great work, not just done by Greener NHS and leading the way on actually making practical, tangible reductions, but organisations like Mobility Ways, like Centre for Sustainable Healthcare, where it's about empowering people to be able to take real positive actions that make a difference to their lives. From a travel perspective, for example, it is not just about the clean air. But there was a great study that came out, I think it was 24, that showed that people's productivity in the workplace improved if they did more active travel. Well, this isn't mentioning greenhouse gases. We know that active travel is better for that. It's not even mentioning personal health and the physical and mental well-being that improves through physical activity. But it's saying to companies and businesses that you can have a more productive workforce if you enable them to be able to, even if it's not 100% of the journey, part of the journey being more active. So for me, yes, we end up, if we take the actions that we would all like to see, we do end up with lower global temperatures, lower greenhouse gases. That's brilliant. But actually, it's the clean air. It's the reduction in dementia that we get from doing these things. There are so many benefits from the co-benefits from doing things better.
There's been some really interesting work in the States on marketing and what language you use with people. If you say, let's reduce greenhouse gas emissions in order to save the planet, you don't get much of a response. But if you say, your daughter's asthma is made worse by traffic fumes, you get a completely different kind of response there. Julie, I wonder if I could bring you in for the organizations whose representatives are taking part in this webinar and listening to this. How should they balance the pressure, which may come through their compliance teams or the law indeed, or from consumer pressure to show progress on this, with the reality that making carbon cuts, there is low-hanging fruit that gets you an immediate dividend in reducing emissions, but a lot of the measures take time to feed through, and you don't get a quick result.
Well, I think this actually leans pretty nicely into what's been discussed previously about the other ways in which to frame it. So when we work with organizations, more often than not, we don't sit in a sustainability budget. We're solving not only carbon reduction, but we're actually solving an operational challenge. So, from the moment you start reframing the same data that you absolutely use to track and measure emissions reduction, but framing it as a parking problem or a recruiting problem or a retention problem becomes a lot more relevant to facilities and HR and operations. And suddenly there's budget and suddenly there's board attention to it. So I actually think organizations can start to reframe how they're looking at their net zero roadmaps and start to hook real tangible ROI to it at the same time. And you're almost killing two birds with one stone. You're solving a real problem for an employee traveling to work, where if they're congested or they can't find a parking space, that can be quite stressful, that can be quite emotive. You're solving that problem as well as reducing CO2.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I suppose it's that dreadful word that Matt used, co-benefits, but it does actually do a lot of heavy lifting. Look, I gather we've got some fantastic questions from you all taking part. So let's move on with that straight away. I'm also delighted to see that I think a couple of people have won books already. And Julie, I should just say that the book very much endeavours to reframe how we talk about all of this. In fact, the word climate doesn't even appear on the cover, which is a very deliberate decision. So let's crack on with some of these questions. Jonathan Hankin, thank you very much for yours. Hugh's 7 actions for real zero are very admirable, but seem aimed at individuals. How do these actions change for organizations? That's a very popular question. And I think that's a good one for you, Hugh, to pick up on. So what does it mean for organizations rather than us as individuals?
It's an excellent one, and it's exactly the same play. So this is all about market forces, right? I was raised probably, I guess I'm a bit older than you, David, but I was raised in doing the right thing.
I don't know if you are, actually.
And I was raised to do the right thing. It doesn't matter whether it would make a difference. You just did the right thing. But of course, if everyone just says, well, I'm not going to do anything because my next door neighbor won't, or what about the person in India or China, nothing changes. And if you think of the Second War, we had people volunteering as SOE agents to be dropped into occupied France when their survival chances were 11 days. But they did it because it was the right thing. By taking leadership as individuals, we create a cascade of effects. And if each one of us influences 7 people, which we can, advertisers tell us, the 12th cycle of infection, 16 billion people have changed, which is nearly twice the number of people on the planet. So individual actions like moving your bank account, moving your investments, moving your food, moving your transport, and engaging politically and spreading the message makes an enormous difference. But every one of those is applicable to a company. So a company can move its banking. Now, I know that if you need international bank transfers, it's hard to move from a main high street bank. But there is one, it's Handelsbanken. They're really big. They can do that. And lots of royal colleges and large organizations have moved, and lots of universities are planning to. Investments, again, the same can be done. In terms of power supply, it's easy to go to 100% renewable or to get a power purchase agreement for your organization. And remember that after the Ukrainian invasion by Russia, the rest of us were paying €1.73 per kilowatt hour. Google was still paying 4 cents because they owned the power plants. So businesses, even small businesses, can make a difference. Food is easy, the food you supply to your staff. You can go vegetarian by default for your meetings. And transport is very easy as a transport policy for your company. So rather than making an individual choice as I do, and I know you do, David, that we cycle everywhere, Julie's outfit can help people do that and create a transport structure that allows for, firstly, foot transport and bicycle if you have to travel because you might work from home, or public transport, and then car shares working their way up the rankings. So I think everything that can we do as individuals can be done as organizations. And we can feel really good about those things because of the impact it has on those around us. And if we can just create this cascading domino falling of individual actions and corporates, everyone on this call, there are 700 of us, we're already on the 5th cycle of infection, as it were. You've only got 7 more to go and the world has changed.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. I mean, I find something very powerful if I'm speaking to corporate leaders or even people in the middle ranks of a large organization, public or private sector. Often they're very anxious about, well, what can I actually do? And I say, well, actually, within your own workplace, you'll have meetings, there'll be endless decisions day by day, hour by hour. And actually, you can be and should be a bit of a pain in the neck. Keep raising it. Every decision an organization makes should come with a very clear-sighted analysis of what its implications for climate, good or bad. Matt, I saw you raise a hand there.
I was just going to say, I've used exactly those 7 and translated them exactly into businesses. So it's I don't see them as individual actions. They are individual actions, but no more individual than they are group or organisation. It's about changing the ethos within the workplace. They are as applicable to a workplace as they are to you or I. So I'd say do both. This is that twin track approach.
Yeah. Okay. Well, let's move on. We've got a busy list of questions here. So let's go. David Mason asks, given the urgency, is an offsetting effort a necessity, not a choice? And that plays a little bit to what Hugh was saying about the growth in emissions. Is this more a case of finding a way to scale it up? That we might be thinking we have a choice, but actually we don't. Who wants to pick that up? Maybe we'll come to you, Hugh.
I'll start with it first. I mean, you're absolutely right, David. I mean, I started by saying we must just stop emitting because that's the quickest thing we can do. We must, but you're absolutely right. We are going to have to use every one of these things: biomass storage, direct air capture, enhanced weathering. We're going to have to we have to throw everything at it because we're so way over the amount of CO2. And remind you, a fifth of the CO2 in the atmosphere will still be boiling us in 33,000 years. So we have to stop. We have to scale. And in my view, we're going to have to geoengineer because we've done that experiment. I mean, ask me 5 years ago, I said, don't go near it. It's nuts. I don't think we're going to have a choice now. We've run out of rubber and run out of road now. Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, this is great. I'm going to leap to a question by Suzanne Gonzalez. And I like this kind of question because it's just very specific. And that's kind of the way I think all the time, pragmatically. If a finance director asked you tomorrow, we have 500K earmarked for offsets, where should it actually go? What would you tell them? People want the practical reallocation, not just the critique. Who'd like to pick that up? I'm going to go to either Julie or Matt and look for a volunteer, I think, for that.
Well, I'm always going to say you should direct it to reducing your carbon footprint within your organisation. There are so many things that you can do to not get to the point of needing to offset. Start at the source. I am a data guru. I love data. And I think fix the data, always understand what the data is telling you. If you don't measure it, you won't track it. So get those baselines in place and invest to do that. Look at your commuting data, look at your carbon data set. No carbon credit has ever told an organisation where its staff actually live. Why 80% are travelling alone in a car when 98% have an alternative sustainable travel option? You know, why a third of your workforce are driving straight past a bus stop to get to work? And what would it take to get on that bus? What would we be able to do? Would we be able to incentivize? Would we be able to implement policy? So, you know, you need to start the source and invest in the right solutions that are going to reduce your emissions. You can't buy your way out of not knowing your own organisation.
That's really interesting, and that's highly pragmatic, isn't it? So you'd have a very clear answer on the 500K. What about you, Matt? What should the 500K go on?
Everything Julie said. Absolutely agree. This is about reduction. This is any sort of offsets is only ever a supportive role. It is not going to be a substitute for understanding your data, understanding your supply chain, understanding the energy that you use. That, I think, you would get far more bangs for your buck than trying to spend it in some foreign climes doing something that you've got no control over. You've got no tangible or practical ability to work out whether it is making a difference or not.
You might be lost in the forest of Ghana that I encountered. Hugh, you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, isn't it? So I would agree. Go straight. Firstly, look at your scope 1. So what are you burning yourself? And that may be the fuel in your cars and petrol and your gas boilers and all of that stuff. So demolish your scope 1. Now, if you're a small business, it won't be very much. If you're a big business, it may well be. So the whole business of getting rid of gas burning, for instance, in your buildings, demolish your scope 1. Deal with scope 2. That can be easy, just to move to a 100% renewable energy supply. But if you're a big business, you might need to get a power purchase agreement. Now, that will save you a truck ton of money. I mean, vast quantities of money in the next 10 years, but it'll have an upfront cost. You'll need to get your lawyers in. You'll need to get a Curios. You'll need to get these people. So use it to do that because you will reap a huge reward downstream. Address the food and the transport issues again, because they're low-hanging fruit on your scope 2 and your scope 3. And then finally, if you've got a bit of budget left, why not use that to start engaging your supply chain and those up and down above you? Use that money to convene the people you work with to say, look, we've got a bunch of change here. We might be able to feed that in to support you in your decarbonisation process, because the next company downstream of you, scope 1 and 2, is your scope 3. So pick them off in scopes, and I would use the money for that, knowing that if you are big enough, you're going to make a lot of money back that you can then reinvest in decarbonisation from these actions.
I think one of the really interesting aspects of that question, which I think we've all enjoyed, is the assumption in the question about the 500k that it is allocated for offsetting. And I think a lot of this is about challenging that sort of thinking that might be easy but misguided. This reminds me of talking to the guy running the port in Hull on the Humber, enormous flat-roofed buildings there. And they made a decision as a company to spend £6.5 million on rooftop solar. And I said, well, how many years to get your money back on that investment? Thinking he would say 6 or 7 or 8. He said 2. Within 2 years, we've actually paid this investment off. And I said, well, that's terrific for the climate. He said, nothing to do with the climate. It's just it makes business sense. And I think once we're in this kind of era with cheap renewables and people understand it and actually what's achievable, it's going to make a huge difference. Okay, so a question from Howard. Sorry.
And what about the employees, David? There's another thought. I mean, your employees, you're partly responsible for their emissions because you're paying them. What a great gift to be able to say, well, we'd like to support you by giving you £6,000 or 10 grand towards your air source, your air source heat pump or your solar panel.
Incentivize them. Absolutely, you should incentivize your employees. Some of these large organizations have access to thousands of people where they could be nudging behaviors in the right direction by incentivizing. They should absolutely do that.
Julie, is it your sense that doesn't happen enough?
I think the sense is that I think there's a lot of push at the moment to be, what's the ROI? How are we going to generate return on investment? And that's why I'm really keen to lean businesses into the other operational challenges that decarbonising can bring, because you can build a business case. We've helped clients build business cases to be able to find budget, to be able to achieve their sustainability goals, but also resolve a lot of other problems that are seen within the organization. The issue you've got is a carbon credit is a single purpose instrument. Whereas if you're genuinely reducing over time, you have longevity and you have reduction year after year after year that you can report on and is genuine.
Yeah, no, that's nicely answered, Julie. Thank you for that. We've got a great question here from Howard. Even on the most aggressive decarbonisation pathway, some emissions stay genuinely unavoidable for years. Aviation, certain industrial processes, parts of healthcare. So we've got the medics on the panel to tackle this one. If a hospital can't electrify its entire estate by next year, what should it do with the emissions it physically can't cut yet? Matt, that's a great one. In fact, I mentioned Hull and the port. Actually, the NHS Trust in Hull invested in the Field of Dreams solar park on a field near the hospital, which I thought was a fantastic thing. But it's a fair question, isn't it? If you can't electrify rapidly for all kinds of reasons, what about the emissions you physically can't cut?
Brilliant question. Really like it. So hospitals and trusts, hospital trusts have got emissions made up of multiple different sectors, energy being one of them, travel and transport, medical kit and equipment, anaesthetic gases, all sorts of other things. For me, it's about having the plan in place. So it may not be able to electrify the entire estate by next year, but it can look at the care pathways that patients are going down, for example. So organisations that Centre for Sustainable Healthcare work with, for example, help set up one-stop clinics. This reduces the amount of travel, reduces the amount of emissions associated with delivering care. So there are actually many, many, many things that hospitals can do. And I think one of the dangers has been that people firstly look at nice shiny things and say, oh, I need to have a shiny thing, I need to spend my money on a shiny thing, which is fine, but it's not going to answer or solve everything. So I think that for me, it's knowing that you've got to think about all of the emissions from an organisation and not just focus in on one particular bit. Yes, do the estate, but don't forget all of the other bits as well, and think about the benefits for patients and staff of doing some of the other actions as well.
Great. And
sorry. So we work with a lot of NHS organisations, and what we're actually going down the route of is actually utilising the assets they already have better. You'll find that a lot of NHS trusts have fleet cars that they use on on a regular basis, but are often dormant for long periods of time. How can we utilize those assets better so that there isn't wastage, and so that we're reducing emissions through sharing that vehicle? Or, sorry, Hugh's got his hand up.
Well, after you, Julie, carry on, please.
Yeah. So utilization of what you've already got and doing that better can also be result in reducing emissions.
Hugh, pick it up. And is that the idea that there's actually an awful lot you can do straight away if you put your mind to it and do the research?
There is. And there's a slight danger in saying, oh my God, it's going to take us 18 months or 2 years to do X, let's suppose, in our power supply. Therefore, we need to divert resource and effort to doing something which might be offsetting now. The problem with that is opportunity cost. It's finance and it's staff time to deliver the thing that delays you doing the really big thing that you've got to do. And there are some very quick, tight gearing. So transport is one. It's so easy to get those sorts of plans in place. That makes a difference. The food supply we've talked about, we've now got 19 NHS trusts in pilots moving to vegan by default menus, much as New York hospitals did. And bear in mind, this is not preachy stuff. 92% patient satisfaction with the food in those New York hospitals, 36 cents per meal saving, 38% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So we can do that, and that's good for British jobs and British farming. Going back to the power purchase agreements bit, if organisations are not there, they can get corporate sleeve PPAs, which are basically new to ground. Essentially, the bond market raises money, they build a solar farm and wind turbines, you own it, and you're decoupled from the energy market, therefore you pay low prices. It saves millions of pounds a year. And that means, of course, that if you leave your ventilator on standby or someone leaves a screen on, it sort of doesn't matter because there's no carbon cost associated with the use of that particular power. So I would still focus, as I said earlier, on the scope 1 and 2 and not get distracted by going, oh, that's going to take us a year to get in place. Focus the efforts on doing that because that's where the really big bucks are.
That's great. Dan Gampson's been very patient. He posed a question which is actually very highly supported by others taking part in this. But I'm gonna pair his question with Lisa Prickett's question. So Dan's is, do you foresee there being an overarching governing body to ensure credibility of offsets? That's really interesting. And Lisa Prickett asks, what are the expectations from the panel that the voluntary market will become regulated for more than just aviation? So this is really about governance, and I guess at the heart of it is the credibility of the offsetting system. Matt, do you want to pick that up? I mean, how reliable the existing monitoring and oversight bodies are now, and should there be maybe one, presumably run by the UN or something? What about actually turning the voluntary market into something that's much better regulated, which I know is a criticism that's been around for years?
Absolutely. I think that, if there's a choice between regulated and unregulated, and I think we've had an unregulated market for however long now, and it just feels, am I allowed to say money-making scam? It feels that there are people there to try and make money out of it rather than actually do the thing which they're meant to be doing, i.e., reducing and removing carbon from the atmosphere. So I think that there has to be something that is more regulated than there is at the moment. I think you're absolutely right, though, is who would do that? Who would be the overarching governing body? The UN, I think, has come into a little bit of difficulty with sort of American politics recently. May that return and rise like a phoenix from the flames at some point and become a more acceptable global force for good. I kind of hope so, because I don't think that there's anybody else who would be able to influence such a wide global. Realistically, this has to be a global agreement. We can't have a number of different regulated and unregulated bodies that sort of accept stuff written on the back of an envelope, which kind of feels a bit like at the moment. So do I think that there needs to be a global governing body? Absolutely, yes. Is it going to be the UN? Quite probably. Is it suitable in its current state? Probably not. But absolutely, I do expect there to be better regulation than there is at the moment. There has to be.
Julie, what's your sense when dealing with your clients who are interested in this and maybe float the notion of offsetting, and actually whether it's sufficiently regulated to pass muster, to be credible?
I think generally the clients we're working with are trying to do the right thing. A lot of the ones that are offsetting do have quite in-depth sustainability plans, and they're doing carbon reporting that's either mandated or because they feel they should be. I think, we need something. I mean, we need something from the government or someone to help mandate what organisations should be reducing emissions on. So absolutely, do we then need to have some sort of legislation over the top of how that is then resulted in reduction? We would be foolish as Mobility Ways to be waiting for some sort of mandate on that. We've been working in climate decarbonisation, commute decarbonisation for the last 26 years without it. And fortunately, our clients can see the opportunities of working with us and what that means for them as an organisation. But so, yeah, we definitely don't wait for it, but it would be great if it could come.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm going to pick up with the question from Emily Jackson, which actually really does play to what you were saying, Julie. Could improving public transport combat the health issues and the commuter emissions? Of course, the answer is yes, but she adds, public transport seems to be struggling a lot in the UK. There's actually a million different reasons for that, but maybe we could examine those. But it could solve a lot of issues and allow us to enjoy the journeys a bit more. I read the other day a really interesting assessment of public transport in a survey around the world, and there are places that really make it work. It's where the quote was, if your public transport is good enough, your office workers choose to go by public transport rather than go by car. Not that they have to. And I think if it's efficient and reliable and clean and so forth, you're a long way there. What problems do you identify in response to Emily's question, Julie, about the kind of issues that public transport is facing? You described, I thought, rather graphically, the idea of driving past a bus stop. But
yes.
What does it take? What does it take to get the person out of the car and onto the bus?
Yeah, well, we actually run an annual commute census. And so we actually get a lot of results from that and the responses of that help inform us on what is actually happening with the infrastructure on the ground. And you've rightly said it, to be fair, David, the 49% of our respondents have, in the last survey has said that it's to do with reliability, frequency. And so what we try to do is use data to support informing some of the public transport providers, because they often don't know what they don't know. I mean, obviously they would know through complaints and such like that there's inefficiencies in what they're providing. But again, NHS is a good example. The shift patterns that nurses and doctors are expected to work on, more often than not, there is no option for them to get a bus into work in the morning. If they have a shift pattern that starts at, say, 6 o'clock in the morning, more often than not, they can't get to work in time. The bus is there, it turns up, but it doesn't get them to work in time. So slight shifts in either timings or looking at how they can get better patronage through diverting their routes through more clusters of people that are travelling to work. That's sort of what we support with, the data in the background that can aid the decisions for the infrastructure on the ground. It needs to be improved, so we all need to work together to do that.
Let's pick up a question. Oh, Matt, I saw your hand in the other.
Two very quick points on that. Firstly, after reading your book, David, I would suggest people read Transport for Humans by Rory Sutherland, who talks a lot about how humans could be transported and how to solve some of the problems. I think the second is, and I'm not part of Mobility Ways other than enjoying the hospitality of being here, but I think that personalised travel plans are particularly important because it helps show people how it can be done and how it's possible, rather than the current, well, I don't know enough about how I could use public transport, where it runs, when it runs, could I get to work on time? So I think, for me, if every organisation had personalised travel plans for their staff, that would actually go quite a long way to getting people onto public transport and knowing what the options were, and that then leads to improvement through increased demand.
Yeah,
really interesting.
Often you still give someone the choice through surfacing what options they have, then you'll find that those choices tend to be more sustainable anyway. And then if you could incentivize over the top, amazing.
It's an interesting kind of societal, generational question from Claire Thornton. I'm going to throw it at you, Hugh, first of all. How do we convince the older generation that it's so important to make small changes to how we all live? I guess the 7 principles that you outlined. I feel the younger generations are mostly on board. Interestingly, actually, that mostly is doing quite a bit of heavy lifting, I think, because I think not every young person is automatically on board with this. But many older people feel it is scaremongering. And of course, my eye fell on this question because we do live in a time now, sadly, where the political consensus around climate action has fractured. That it was pretty robust for nearly 2 decades, but we now have reform being openly hostile to net zero and everything about it, and dragging the Conservatives over in that direction as well. So this is a very live political debate now. And interestingly, that Claire's identified this generational shift. How do you find you best make the case, bearing in mind perhaps that your audience is either agnostic or hostile to mentioning greenhouse gases, climate change, global warming, and all the rest?
It's a very good point, David. So the answer is I'm going to chuck that at you, really, because you're probably the most important person on this panel from that point of view. We have not only misinformation, which you'd understand is just incorrect fact being spread by mistake, but you have disinformation, which is strategically placed incorrect to try to prevent action. And one could point at large petrochemical states for this, but we also know, for instance, that Russia has been heavily involved in such influencing activity because its entire economy depends on the war now, but it depended on oil and gas. And it was very interesting that a few years ago, when #1 on the UK National Strategic Risk Register was climate change, #1 on the Russian Strategic Risk Register was action on climate change. The biggest threat to the Russian economy and state was that people would do something about climate. And we now have the tech bros owning the social media platforms who are deeply embedded with those same industries, who are participating in the promulgation of this false information. And you've got a stranglehold on the mainstream media now, very largely by corporate interests who also would rather there were no action. So it's very difficult for anybody who's getting their own Twitter feed or their social media, or an older person who's reading a broadsheet newspaper, to know what the answer is. So the first thing is we have to get the narrative out in different ways. And George Marshall, who is the expert in climate change communication, says it comes down to us as individuals. It comes down to a conversation like this that we're having with 700 people this morning, and each of those 700 talking to people in their workplace and their next door neighbours, because it turns out that every one of us underestimates the level of concern that others have. So we open that up, we start creating, feeding the fire in a rather positive way. The second bit is we need to stop making this abstract. This isn't a threat to future generations. It's not a threat to the poorest abroad. It's not about polar bears and tree frogs, although it is. It has to be personal. So if we take public health messaging in other regards, cigarette smoking, if a random person says to you, David, smoking's bad for you, you should stop doing that, it does have a bit of an impact, actually, and especially if a lot of people do. But it has more impact if it's a doctor, because you trust their voice. But what's much more effective is your daughter. And daughters turn out to dads and smoking to be more effective even than sons. And it's partly because they nag you every day. but it's partly because they say, Daddy, they don't say, Daddy, please stop smoking because it gives you a 2.7 increased risk of bronchogenic carcinoma. They say, Daddy, please stop smoking because I don't want you to die and leave me without a dad. Which basically brings to the final point. If we're talking to people of my generation, it's about our children, right? Which parent on this call would not die for their child? That's the message. I don't care what you think. It's about your kids.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, actually, that's the motivation for me to dedicate my book to my new grandson, and it really hit home. And I know it's a little bit of a cliche, you know, when John Kerry signed the United States into the Paris Climate Agreement, he had his granddaughter on his knee at the United Nations. It's very evocative, actually. But it does provide a really valuable new perspective in terms of how we think about this. We're the generation, we are the people right now, this decade, who can make choices, which will have a direct bearing on our offspring and their offspring down the track. I think one really important aspect of this is, you mentioned the disinformation. Any incumbent industry, any vested interest will fight like hell to remain viable. And we saw the horse and carriage lobby were vicious about the arrival of the motor car, and coming up with all kinds of stories. Motor cars will kill you, they'll explode, you'll die, you'll have terrible accidents. We're seeing exactly the same now. The combination of many of the big car makers and the oil industry coming up with stuff, planting stories that EVs all catch fire. Well, actually, they catch fire far less than vehicles that contain a tank of highly flammable fuel. Guess what? I mean, there's a million things like that the batteries all drain. And well, we know now that's all been exaggerated. And the great fossil fuel accusation against renewables was always, well, they're good as far as they go, but they're intermittent and unaffordable. But what we've just seen in the last few months, I mean, this peace deal in the Gulf may hold, and one hopes that it does, but it's shown that fossil fuel supplies can be intermittent and definitely unaffordable, and people with petrol and diesel cars really struggling at the moment to fill them up, I think, in many cases. So we're suddenly seeing the case for renewables with batteries, and especially electric transport, for a million reasons that we've aired here. Matt, you had your hand in the air.
Yeah, I was just going to say that from I remember a survey not so long back which said that if you want somebody to be involved to make changes, ask a 50-year-old woman. 50-year-old women get more things done than anybody else. So I love to think that it's the young people who are going to make the change, but actually, well, and certainly, you know, both from the survey results and from people who I know, 50-year-old women, they are the bee's knees in terms of taking action. But I think it's also that, how would I convince a 58-year-old to make changes? I would ask them what's important to them. And often it is the things that are important to all of us. It's that community. It's being able to eat food. It's being able to see friends. It's being able to go for a walk. That, for me, is how we get people to make changes. We take it back to them and what's important in their lives. And you're absolutely right. For some people, it's children and grandchildren. But for those who don't have children and grandchildren, actually, I want you to be selfish. I want you to have clean air to breathe. I want you to have clean water to breathe. Yes, it'd be lovely if, you know, other people's children in 50 years from now have clean air to breathe. But if you're in your 50s, you might have another 30 or 40 years left. Breathe clean air yourself. Don't have heat waves.
Yeah.
You know, it's that sort of practical things. And I think the other is that people in their 50s and 60s remember what it was like when they were kids. And this is that shifting baseline, that if the only temperature that you know now is summers at 40 degrees and May's at 35 degrees, well, that's not what we remember. I mean, Julie, you're obviously a lot younger than everybody else, but you know what I mean. And it's reminding people that, you know, what we wanted, what we liked, what we enjoyed when we were growing up. Actually, we want that for other people as well.
We've got some great questions. Yeah, sorry, Hugh. Yeah, go ahead.
No, Matt, just to pick up on your point, I think you're absolutely right, and I should have said it, that we need to meet people where they are. And sometimes that's not the primary agenda. We know that climate change is 7th on the salience now for voters in Britain. Even health is number 5. People are worried about migration. They're worried about the economy and so forth. And we can reframe things in a very genuine way. So if, for instance, we look at food, 38% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the food supply chain. It's appalling. Our farmers aren't well treated. We've got 63% of the British adult population obese or overweight. It costs the British economy 126 billion a year. So we could reframe that to say, instead of saying it's good for climate to take this action, we could be saying, if we move to local, seasonal, vegetable-based things, we support the British farmer, the hard-working British farmer. We get British food for British people with British jobs. We support our National Health Service, which is running into trouble. And you, Matt, the hard-working British taxpayer, is saved £0.7 trillion a year from your taxes by doing that. And we stop the offshoring of money to large corporates who are making their money abroad. It's exactly the same outcome, but it's a different framing.
Yeah, I mean, I think this question of framing, as I mentioned, it's a big theme in my book. I mean, I think if you talk to people about wildfires in London that kicked off when we hit 40 degrees 4 years ago, 40 houses were burnt to the ground by wildfires in the London area. Most people sort of don't clock that, but you know, we're in a changed climate. This is here, this is now, and there's a lot we can do about that. But I think that the more one can talk about present day impacts and solutions, I think it might help with sharing understanding. We're into the kind of final run here, so let's just try to give really brief answers to these questions so we can cover as many as possible. Sean Collins, is the argument being considered as to what percentage of national GDP internationally needs to be invested in order to meet a future viable goal of getting to net zero in time to save the planet? Well, 20 years ago, Nick Stern, came out with this landmark report that said it's cheaper to crack on with it now than to wait and pay for the consequences later. Matt, do you want to quickly pick up that, and we'll just do maybe a brief answer and try to rattle through some of the others?
Yes, I mean, I think that the Stern report was 2% of GDP. I think
something like that, of that order, yeah.
And it was something like 3 times that if we didn't do anything. I don't think that argument has changed at all. So, yes, we need to spend something now, but there's all the additional benefits of doing so.
Yeah, there's that key metric. Jonathan Hankin, what should we prioritise to ensure that carbon offset projects we invest in are credible and deliver long-term climate impact rather than short-term box ticking? Julie, do you want to have a quick crack at that?
Invest in reducing first.
Okay, fair enough. Commendable brevity, Julie, that's great. Ray and Clary, people often talk about offsetting and only occasionally, actually this is a great one, and I'm glad you've raised this, Ray, only occasionally talk about insetting. Is there a reason that offsetting is favoured over insetting? Hugh, do you want to pick up this? Is it arguably just semantics, or was it actually a meaningful distinction that's significant?
Well, I think we go back to the beginning. The offsetting issue is that it's been abused by people to be able to say that it's rolled into this thing of net without saying which scopes, by when, how, and using what tools. So that's why I think there's the difference. But yes, I'm an inset and an offset person.
Right. Well, that's terrific. Lucas Massado, thanks for your question. How should we balance carbon avoidance credits against removal credits to build a resilient offset strategy? Matt, do you want to have a crack at that?
Personally, I wouldn't buy avoidance credits. I would avoid everything within your role and responsibility as your organisation. So therefore, almost by definition, the only thing that you can, if you were going to buy credits, would be about removal credits. Avoidance shouldn't be something that's bought. It should be something that's done.
Because probably across the spectrum of carbon actions, carbon avoidance is possibly one of the most contentious, isn't it? I think. AD Poole, in community, transport and social impact sectors, what would good carbon offsetting look like alongside efforts to reduce vehicle emissions directly? So that might be one for you, Julie, actually. In community transport and social impact sectors, I mean, is there such a thing as good carbon offsetting, and what would it look like?
I mean, ideally that the vehicle that's running is full.
Okay.
the vehicles that run have full patronage, so whether that's a car, and then obviously there's electrification. We're under no illusion that electrification is going to happen anytime soon, so let's make sure that we're utilising the seats that are empty every day. If that vehicle's already going to be running, then either electrify it or ensure that it's full.
Okay, I love that. That's a very specific answer. Thank you, Julie, for that.
David, just on that, we can roll in active transport into that too. So communities can advocate for councils to change. And as we saw in Portsmouth, when they first 20 years ago reduced the speed limit from 30 to 20, the number of women cycling went up 8-fold almost immediately, because women felt safe to be on a road, not being flattened by white man van. So community voices with local councils can also be very important.
But as we know, some of those voices can be extremely loud in the other direction, and an incredible hoo-ha every time a new cycle lane is created, because it impinges on the rights of motorists to drive their enormous cars in our densely populated cities. Hugh, kind of namesake of yours, but with a slightly different spelling, Elizabeth Montgomery, are there specific geographical areas where offsetting would be more beneficial, and where should we focus our collective offsetting efforts? I mean, obviously, this is all based, I guess, on the assumption that you will have taken every action conceivable to reduce your emissions in the first place. And what we haven't touched on is the desperate need to get private capital into nature recovery, restoration, and conservation, and whether there's a piece around that. Hugh, do you want to just quickly jump on that? And we are in the last few minutes here.
Yeah, so very quickly, know that, as Matt said, the planet doesn't know where you're drawing down any more than where you're emitting to, so it doesn't actually make a great difference. As for Matt said earlier on, don't go for the offsetting of like tree planting that's 5 or 10 years, do it for other reasons, but not for climate. You can go very directly to direct coupling, so rather than saying we're going to pay into the carbon market, which, remember, pays to keep trees standing and not chop them down, that's not drawing down. It pays to burn methane from coal fields, which isn't drawing down either. That's what you're buying into in the carbon market. Buy into something that works, for instance, and that you can see directly, which may be biochar, but basalt, for instance, which regenerates soil at the same time. Both of those have a double win. They restore land at the same time as drawing down.
Okay, look, we're going to draw this to a close, but we've got to just make room for this last question from Daniel Shelton. I'll just check with the panelists. Any of you read Kim Stanley Robinson's novel Ministry for the Future? I mean, I have. I don't know if anyone else has. It begins with an absolutely devastating scene in India during a heatwave. But are the panel familiar with this book and the fictional global carbon-based currency that Kim Stanley Robinson suggests as a path forward, and could it incentivize sufficient global action on carbon drawdown? If none of you have read the book, and I'm the only one who has, I'm going to answer Danny's question. And, well, I thought that have you, Matt? I mean, look, I'll just pick this up. It seemed to me a wonderful idea, but actually possibly quite complicated to administer, particularly in a context where not everybody supports the United Nations. And Matt, you touched on that with Trump's attitude to the UN. So I thought it was an interesting proposal. It would take a lot of discussion. I can't see it in pragmatic terms. Look, on that note, I'm going to wrap up my segment of chairing. Actually, a really, really enjoyable panel. The hour and a half has just flown by. I hope it's been useful for everybody. Julie, I'm going to hand back to you to close things off.
Thank you so much, everyone. So we've just put on the screen a couple more webinars that we've got coming up. Please do feel free to sign up to those. We'd love to have as much attendance as possible in our series of webinars. We're also releasing a carbon credits best practice guide. So if you want to know more about everything that we've just discussed about, the importance of reducing emissions before offsetting and choosing quality offsets if you're going to do it, then please do download that guide. Any unanswered questions we will follow up with via email, and of course the lucky winners of David's book, the response will receive those in the post. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending, and thank you so much for our amazing panel.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Great to take part.